They were 3 days out from Mill Haven and 2 days from Carson's Ridge, dragging a loaded wagon through blistering desert heat when it happened. The old gray mule named Copper, 23 years a loyal hauler, planted his hooves in the dirt and wouldn't budge. Not for sweet talk, not for threats, not even when Tobias McGraw, a seasoned trader with hands hardened by decades of trail grit, pulled the lead rope so hard his knuckles turned white. Copper just stood there, still, eyes locked on something ahead, something only he could sense. What came next was something straight out of a real-life Western mystery. Young Finn Talbot wiped the sweat from his brow, squinting down the trail. To him, it looked like empty land, just dust, rocks, and twisted sagebrush. But Tobias knew better. He'd seen this look before. Years ago, near Devil's Canyon, Copper had refused to move and saved them from riding straight into a pit trap. The old mule wasn't stubborn. He was trying to warn them. And this time, he was warning them about death. What they found buried beneath the trail just yards ahead would shake the entire region, reopen a cold case long forgotten, and reveal a dark family secret buried deeper than desert bone. You won't believe what they found. Keep watching. The old mule stopped cold, 4 hooves locked in the red dirt like stone pegs hammered into the earth, and no force on God's green land could make him budge. Not a tug, not a curse, not even the promise of fresh oats. Copper had pulled Tobias McGraw's freight through snow, flash flood, snake country, and Apache land for over 2 decades. But now, on this open stretch of sunburnt trail, 3 days out from Mill Haven, he froze like death itself was standing ahead. Tobias leaned back hard on the lead rope, shoulders straining, jaw clenched, nothing. The mule didn't flinch, didn't blink. Just stared straight down the trail with eyes gone dark and ears pinned back, as if he were listening to something beneath the surface of the earth. Finn Talbot, barely 20 and sweating buckets under his wide-brimmed hat, looked up from the rear of the wagon and called, "Mr. McGraw." He stuck, or just playing games, but Tobias didn't answer. He knew this animal too well. Copper wasn't playing, and he sure as hell wasn't stuck. He was warning them again, just like Devil's Canyon, when Copper had refused to cross what looked like solid ground, only for them to find a hidden pit trap dug by raiders, or tombstone. When the mule had kept them out of a perfect clearing that turned out to be crawling with Apache scouts come sunrise. This was no mule being stubborn. This was a mule that had smelled something wrong in the wind. The trail ahead looked clear as a preacher's lie, winding through low valley scrub and dusty rock, but something about the land had changed. Tobias stepped forward slowly, heart beginning to thud. In 23 years, Copper had never stopped without a reason, not once. And this time, whatever lay ahead on that trail was bad enough to make a mule of iron nerves refuse to take another step. Tobias didn't speak for a long while. He simply stood there beside his mule, one hand resting gently on Copper's warm, muscled neck, the other shading his eyes as he scanned the landscape. To the untrained eye, it was empty country sagebrush, sun, and silence. But Tobias had learned long ago that the desert hides things in plain sight, and sometimes the ones who see it best ain't men at all. He could feel the tension humming through the animal's hide like a pulled wire. It wasn't fear. Copper wasn't skittish. Spooked animals danced, bolted, or shivered. Copper stood like a sentry, like a grave marker, like he'd been stationed here by something older than man's law. After 23 years together, Tobias had stopped questioning the mule's instincts. They'd crossed lands where maps turned to lies, where white men died slow and brown men died forgotten. And every time Copper had paused only 3 times in all those years, it had meant one thing: danger. Not imagined, not possible, real, present, and breathing. Finn shifted his weight behind him, kicking dust with a nervous boot. "Ain't nothing out there, sir," he said, voice a little shaky. "Just dirt and shadow." Tobias didn't answer. His mind had already drifted back to that winter near Devil's Canyon, when Copper had planted himself on a ridge just before sundown. Tobias, irritated, had taken a step without him, and felt the ground sag beneath his boots like sponge. He still remembered the sound of his own heart beating against ribs as he stared into that hidden pit, 4 feet wide, spiked, and meant for killing. And now, the mule had stopped again. In the middle of a route Tobias had traveled at least a dozen times, a trail that was supposed to be safe, well-worn, predictable. That, more than anything, sent a chill crawling up his spine, because Copper never questioned a trail unless the trail itself had changed. And if something had changed here on a stretch just 3 miles from the old Henderson place, then it wasn't the road that had gone bad. It was the truth buried beneath it. The sun climbed higher, dragging the heat with it, turning the dust into fine powder and the wagon wood into tinder. But Tobias barely noticed. His eyes had locked onto something ahead just beyond Copper's line of sight. A small dip in the trail, no more than a yard across, where the dirt darkened ever so slightly. Not wet, not damp, just darker than the rest of the hard-baked earth, like the desert itself had taken a deep breath and held it. In a country that hadn't seen a drop of rain in over a year, darker soil didn't mean water. It meant something was keeping the ground moist, something that didn't belong. Tobias took 3 steps forward. Copper didn't follow. The mule simply turned his head to track him, ears pricked, legs braced as if to say, "Go if you want, but I've done my part." Finn watched from behind the wagon, fidgeting with the edge of his canteen. "Mr. McGraw," he called, "you think we ought to move on? This delay's eating daylight." But Tobias had already climbed into the back of the wagon and retrieved the flat-bladed shovel he always kept tied to the frame. It was dented, dulled, and blackened near the base from years of digging latrines, post holes, and sometimes things he didn't talk about. He walked past Copper without a word. The mule let him go but didn't take his eyes off that patch of earth. Tobias reached the spot and dropped to one knee. He pressed his fingers into the dirt, loose, softer than it should have been. He scraped a thin line across the surface and watched the grains fall like sifted flour. Something had been disturbed here, and not long ago. Not long enough for the desert to forget. The first full shovel bite sank in easy. Too easy. The second came up, wet not with water, but with something older, heavier. Tobias paused. A smell rose, faint but unmistakable, not rot, not death fresh from the kill, something slower, soil-infused, human. His breath caught. A warning was speaking to him now, not in words, but through the mule, through the ground, through every hair standing up on his forearms. He knew this rhythm. He'd felt it once, digging a collapsed cellar, and again when he helped pull a drowned man from the Verde. This wasn't a trail anymore. It was a graveyard. And whatever Copper had sensed was still waiting to be uncovered. By the 3rd shovelful, the blade struck something that wasn't rock, but gave with a sick, spongy thud. Tobias froze. The silence around him grew dense, like the very air was holding its breath. He knelt down, slowly now, and began to clear the dirt with his hands. The soil here clung like memory. With every motion, the outline of fabric emerged blue cotton, faded but intact. A dress. Then came the hand, pale as moonlight and impossibly still, fingers curled inward like they had braced against something awful in her last breath. On the ring finger glinted a band of gold, dulled but unmistakable, a simple wedding ring catching a sharp angle of sun and reflecting it back in a flash like a flare, bright, accusatory, undeniable. Finn let out a sound, half gasp, half prayer. He took a step back, hand drifting toward the pistol on his belt. "Good Lord," he whispered. "What is this?" Tobias didn't reply. His eyes were locked on the ring, and something cold and final pressed against his chest. He knew that ring. Had seen it 2 winters ago, when a young woman stood on the porch of the Henderson Ranch, waving goodbye as Tobias rode off with a satchel of salted pork and dry beans. She was small, warm-eyed, and proud of her husband, proud of the land, proud of being accepted by a family that had never welcomed outsiders. Maria Henderson, the Mexican girl who had married the eldest Henderson boy just before the snows came early that cursed winter. The same girl who, according to Caleb Henderson, had run off with a preacher when spring thawed the valley. But Maria hadn't run anywhere. She'd been buried like an animal, in the middle of a trade route, as if the truth of her life meant less than a pothole in the dirt. Tobias swallowed hard, then reached forward and gently brushed more soil from her sleeve, from her shoulder, from the curve of her cheekbone. Even with time and rot pressing down, there was enough left to be sure. This was her. And someone had made sure she would never speak again. Tobias sat back on his heels, sweat mixing with dust along the creases of his face. But the chill running through his body had nothing to do with the desert wind. It was her. No question. And that changed everything. Maria hadn't left. She hadn't run away. She hadn't followed some wandering preacher with promises of salvation and scripture. She'd been silenced, hidden, forgotten by design. He remembered her laughter, light but firm, as she'd handed him a fresh-baked loaf wrapped in cloth that final morning. She'd said the high desert was hard, but not cruel, not if you worked the land right. She'd believed in the ranch, believed in the family she married into. Tobias had seen it in her eyes, a quiet, stubborn pride, the kind that comes from surviving something. But the Hendersons had always carried shadows behind their hospitality. The patriarch, Henrik, had ruled the land with iron resolve and rigid tradition. His eldest son, Maria's husband, was kind enough but brittle, and the youngest, Caleb, had a smile that never reached his eyes. That terrible winter had taken its toll. First came the frost, then the fever, then the rumors. Henrik fell down the stairs and died overnight. His eldest was found in the barn weeks later, frozen stiff, a bottle of rye in one hand and a shotgun in the other. And Maria, so the story went, vanished come spring, having left a note no one ever saw and taken nothing with her. Tobias hadn't believed it then. He didn't believe it now. Not with her body lying broken in the dirt 3 miles from their front porch. Not with the ring still on her finger like she'd never stopped waiting for someone to come looking. There was no mistake anymore. Maria's disappearance wasn't a tragedy, it was a cover-up. And whoever had written that lie of a tale about her elopement had done so while the truth lay rotting beneath the desert sun. As he stood and wiped his hands on his trousers, Tobias felt something shift inside him. Not rage, not sorrow, something older. A quiet promise. He looked down at Copper, who had begun to pace slowly near the wagon, ears twitching with alertness. They hadn't just stumbled on a body. They had tripped over a secret meant to stay buried, a secret that belonged to the Hendersons. And somewhere out there, someone still wanted it to stay that way. The sound came low at first, like thunder that didn't belong to any storm, then rose, steady and fast hoofbeats. Tobias turned his head slowly, dread crawling like ice down his spine. Copper stopped pacing, his body stiffened, ears pointed straight back in warning. Even the wind seemed to hush, as if the desert itself was listening. 3 riders crested the ridge behind them, emerging from the heat, shimmer like ghosts called up from sun-baked memory. Their silhouettes sharpened with every gallop, one lean and tall in the center, 2 broader, rougher men flanking him. All 3 rode with the easy, practiced motion of men who'd spent more time on horseback than in church pews. All 3 had the look of men who knew how to kill without flinching. Tobias didn't need to squint to recognize the one in front. Caleb Henderson, the youngest son, the survivor, the inheritor of the Henderson name, the land. And Tobias now suspected the secrets. Caleb pulled his horse to a halt a few yards from the grave, boots coated in dust, a wide-brimmed hat shading his pale, unreadable eyes. He dismounted slow, spurs whispering across rock, and gave a smile that didn't touch anything but the corners of his mouth. "Well, well," he drawled, voice smooth as snake oil. "Tobias McGraw. Always knew if trouble was gonna ride into my land, it'd wear your boots." Tobias didn't move, didn't speak. His hand rested on the shovel handle like it was part of him now. He felt Finn shift nervously behind the wagon. The boy's breath was quick and shallow. "This here's a public trail," Tobias said finally. Voice calm but edged. "Been that way for years. Everything within 5 miles of my property line is my business," Caleb replied, taking a few steps closer to the half-dug grave, especially when folks start digging where they got no right. The 2 riders beside him spread out casually, cutting off retreat. One wore a long oilskin duster and had the kind of eyes that didn't blink much. The other chewed a toothpick and rested a hand on the butt of his revolver, like he'd been born that way. Hired guns. Both of them. Not cowhands. Not kin. Professional muscle. This wasn't a conversation. It was a warning. Tobias could feel it in the air, the shift. The moment when talk turns to tension. When the next breath might be your last if you misplace it. He looked past Caleb, to the grave, to the outline of blue fabric barely visible beneath the dirt, then back to the man who now stared at it with something colder than fear in his eyes. And in that frozen silence between past and present, Tobias understood something with bone-deep certainty. Caleb hadn't come to ask questions. He'd come to bury the truth again. The silence cracked like dry timber under a boot heel. Tobias saw Caleb's hand twitch toward his hip, the leather of his holster creaking in the heat. One of the hired guns took a step forward, boots grinding against the gravel, his fingers loose but ready. And just when the world felt tight enough to snap, Copper, who'd stood stone still all this time, let out a sound that tore across the valley like a war drum splitting the sky. It wasn't a bray. It wasn't a scream. It was something older, rawer, like the desert itself, roaring through the lungs of an animal that had seen too many graves and had finally had enough. The mule reared back, hooves pawing the air, eyes wild with fire, the harness straining like rope about to break. Then Copper charged, not away but forward, straight at Caleb's horse. The sudden violence shattered the standoff. Caleb's mount screamed and bucked, stumbling sideways as the mule slammed into it with full shoulder weight. Caleb cursed, thrown off balance, and barely hit the dirt before his horse bolted, reins flailing behind like a ghost's tail. Gunmetal flashed. Tobias didn't wait. He dove toward the wagon, shouting over his shoulder, "Finn, get the rifle." But the boy was frozen, eyes wide, mouth open, breath caught halfway between courage and panic. One of the gunmen shouted something unintelligible and fired, the shot ringing out across the open trail, but it missed, jerking wide as Copper wheeled and kicked. The hired man's horse panicked, spinning in a full circle before galloping into the rocks, with its rider barely holding on. Tobias reached the rifle, an old Winchester wrapped in oilcloth, and swung it around just in time to see the second gunman dismount and drop behind his own horse, using the beast for cover like he'd done this before. Bullets whined past the wagon's iron braces, sending splinters dancing in the air like angry bees. But it wasn't just bullets flying now. It was truth, it was fury, and it had hooves. Copper didn't let up. He chased down Caleb's retreating horse, snapping and kicking with a vengeance Tobias had never seen before, not in battle, not in storm, not even in Devil's Canyon. There was something primal in the mule's rage, something righteous. Like he knew the man who'd buried that girl now stood only paces from the crime. And Copper wasn't done watching anymore. He was the reckoning. The desert settled, but the tension didn't. Gunpowder lingered in the air like burnt sin. Copper stood at the edge of the chaos, flanks heaving, eyes still locked on Caleb like he was daring him to move. The first hired gun was gone, bleeding and limping into the hills, carried by a terrified horse. The second crouched behind his mount, breathing hard, rifle trembling just enough to betray a shaken resolve. Finn, hands finally steady, stood crouched behind the wagon with the rifle Tobias had handed him, eyes no longer wide with fear, but locked with purpose. Tobias rose slowly, barrel aimed dead at Caleb, who lay in the dirt with dust in his mouth and a loaded silence pressing down on his back. The man's pistol was gone, lost in the struggle, but his mouth still worked. "You want to know who killed her?" Caleb rasped, eyes shining now not with anger, but something worse, regret. "You want to know the truth?" Tobias didn't speak. The barrel of the Winchester answered for him. Caleb laughed once, dry and bitter as spoiled whiskey. "It was my brother, Thomas." He put his hands around her neck and squeezed until she stopped moving. The second gunman turned his head. Startled, Finn flinched. Tobias narrowed his eyes but said nothing. Caleb sat upright, dirt clinging to his shirt like guilt, and stared down at the grave as if it might open wide and swallow him next. She found out what he did to our father, that his fall down the stairs wasn't no accident, that Thomas murdered him for the inheritance. Maria said she couldn't live with it, said she'd tell. So he killed her. Just like that. And his voice cracked, I helped him bury her, right here. Thought no one would ever come this way again. He looked up, blinking into the sunlight as if hoping it might blind him from his own memories. You weren't supposed to find her. No one was. Tobias lowered the rifle an inch. Not from mercy, but weight. The truth carried its own gravity. And now he asked quietly, "Now you're here with guns, trying to bury her a second time." Caleb shook his head, a tremble running through him. "No," he said. "I came here to stop the secret from getting out. But part of me always knew this day would come." His voice dropped, softer now, almost boyish. "That mule of yours, he knew it before any of us did." Tobias glanced at Copper, who stood perfectly still, ears twitching, as if listening to ghosts speak through confession. The desert had been waiting a long time for this moment. So had Maria. Caleb's eyes flicked to his side to where his pistol had landed, halfway between the grave and the rocks. It was half buried in the dust, grip glinting under the cruel midday sun, like it still had something to say. Tobias saw the look before the motion. He'd seen it in bar brawls and back alley standoffs, in the twitch of gamblers who'd lost too much, and in the final blink of dying outlaws. The decision to fight wasn't always made in the hand. It started in the eyes. Caleb lunged, not fast but desperate, not smart but cornered, his fingers stretched toward the pistol like a man grasping at salvation. But salvation doesn't come to murderers kneeling beside shallow graves. Tobias fired once, not to kill, to warn. The bullet struck inches from the pistol, kicking up a sharp burst of gravel that stung Caleb's arm and sent the weapon tumbling down the slope. The echo of that shot felt like a judge's gavel slamming through the desert. Caleb froze, chest heaving, hand hovering midair like he didn't know what it belonged to anymore. Tobias walked forward, slow and heavy, each step pressing deeper into the moment. Finn didn't speak. Copper didn't move. The second gunman had long since lowered his rifle, realizing this was no longer a job, it was a reckoning. "You had your choice," Tobias said, voice flat but full. "And now I've got mine." He aimed the rifle square at Caleb's chest, finger curling tighter, breath slowing to a heartbeat's edge. He could end it, right now. No jury, no jail, no more lies, just the end. But then he looked at the grave, at the blue hem of Maria's dress, at the wind gently brushing sand from her final resting place, as if trying to give her back her dignity. And Tobias remembered why he came. Not for revenge, not for blood, but for truth, for the dead, for the living boy behind the wagon, learning what kind of man Tobias McGraw truly was. Slowly, deliberately, Tobias lifted the rifle away from Caleb's chest. "You're gonna stand trial," he said. "You and your brother both." Caleb blinked. "He'll run. Not if I get to him first." A long silence stretched, and then Caleb nodded once broken, but no longer resisting. Justice, Tobias knew, didn't always ride a horse or wear a badge. Sometimes it looked like a man with dirt on his boots and a mule by his side, digging up the past one shovel at a time. Before Tobias could signal for Caleb to stand, the soft click of a cocked hammer broke the stillness. Finn had stepped from behind the wagon, rifle raised, eyes locked on the second gunman. His hands weren't shaking anymore. "Drop it," the boy said, voice low but sure. The gunman hesitated just long enough for Copper to step forward. The mule planted himself between Finn and the danger, ears pinned, body tense like a coiled spring. The man let his weapon fall, not out of fear of Finn, but out of awe for an animal that looked like it would fight God himself to protect the boy behind it. Tobias said nothing. He didn't need to. This was Finn's moment now, his passage. The boy lowered his rifle, breath ragged, but he didn't look away. He'd crossed a line, and there was no going back. They made Caleb dig. With Copper watching every stroke of the shovel, he unearthed not one but 3 bodies. Maria's was only the first, buried beneath a crooked juniper root. They found an older man in Sunday clothes, Thomas and Caleb's father, skull cracked. The inheritance Thomas had wanted didn't come cheap. A third grave revealed a teenage stable hand, barely 17. "He knew," Caleb muttered, voice hollow. He saw too much. The desert didn't hide sin. It preserved it, layer by layer. Tobias knelt beside the graves, jaw clenched, rage battling sorrow. Justice wasn't just for Maria anymore. It was for all of them. Night fell hard over the canyon. Sheriff Garrett arrived by lantern light, tipped off by Tobias's earlier message left at the last outpost. He took one look at the bodies, one look at Caleb and said nothing, just nodded once. The shackles clicked like thunder on bone. As the wagons rolled out and the law took over, Tobias lingered by the grave, hat in hand. Finn stood beside him, quiet. "Will we forget this?" the boy finally asked. Tobias looked at him, then at Copper still standing, still watching the wind like it might bring back ghosts. "No," he said, "but we'll carry it right, and under the stars, with the smell of dust and death in the air, a man, a boy, and a mule stood guard over the truth, because sometimes justice comes late, but never too late." 3 weeks later, the town of Dry Fork stood still under a pale blue sky, its dust-laced wind brushing through open windows and courthouse steps like it, too, had come to witness the verdict. Word had spread like wildfire the McGraw mule had unearthed more than bones. It had unearthed a truth buried deeper than any outlaw's grave. The trial drew crowds, not because they knew the Henderson brothers, but because everyone in town had something buried they feared would rise. Sheriff Garrett gave his statement in 12 sentences, each one sharp as a coffin nail. Tobias, when called to testify, said only this: "The desert told the story, I just listened." The courtroom held its breath. Caleb sat shackled, thinner now, as if guilt had chewed him down to his bones. Thomas, captured at a mining outpost 2 counties west, stared at the jury like men who'd never been told no by fate. But fate came anyway. 12 votes, unanimous, guilty. As the judge pronounced the sentence, execution, by hanging at dawn, no cheers rose, no curses were shouted. Just silence. Heavy and honest. Justice hadn't come with fire or blood. It had come on the back of a mule, with dust on its hooves and a story no one could deny. They buried Maria Henderson again, this time not in secret, not in shame, and not alone. A real headstone stood at the edge of Tobias's ranch, beneath a cottonwood tree whose roots would hold her gently instead of hiding her. The carving was simple: Maria Henderson. She wasn't lost, she was silenced. Women from town brought wildflowers. Sheriff Garrett came without a badge. Even the preacher who once called Maria a wayward girl stood and wept as he offered a prayer he hadn't written down. Tobias said nothing during the service. He only stood beside the grave, one hand on Finn's shoulder, the other resting on Copper's neck. And though the boy didn't understand every word of the eulogy, he understood the silence, the kind that spoke louder than thunder. Because Maria's story wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to the earth, to the wind, to every person who ever feared they'd vanish without anyone knowing their name. From victim to witness, from forgotten to remembered. And somewhere, Tobias thought, in the hush between gusts of wind, Maria finally exhaled. By early spring, the desert began to bloom not with fanfare, but with quiet resilience. Tiny yellow flowers pushed through dry soil like they had somewhere to be. Tobias fixed the back fence with Finn by his side, the boy now taller, eyes steadier. He asked fewer questions these days, not because he knew everything, but because he knew enough. Copper still woke at dawn, still walked to Maria's grave every morning and stood there for exactly 9 minutes before returning to the barn. No one told him to. No one dared stop him. Scars had settled into the land places where shovels once broke the crust, where truth had risen like smoke from a dying fire. But there was peace in that. Not a clean peace, not an easy one, but the kind you earn on quiet nights. Tobias sometimes sat by the fire and looked at Finn across the room, at the boy who now slept with a rifle nearby but never used it in fear. He'd grown into the kind of man the world needed more of, and sometimes when the wind moved just right, Carrying dust and memory across the hills, Tobias could almost hear Maria's voice. Not in words, but in the stillness, the kind that comes when justice has finally been done, and the ones left behind choose to keep riding anyway. Long after the last rope had tightened, and long after the dust settled over courtroom steps and fresh-dug graves, the wind returned to the trail soft, slow, almost gentle, like a mother brushing hair behind a child's ear. It whispered through the broken sage and bent mesquite, past the rocks that had once covered secrets, and over the hollow where copper had stopped cold. And in that wind was something else, something older than guilt, older than justice. It was the sound of Maria's lullaby, not the one she sang out loud, but the one she'd held in her chest the night she died, still warm, still unfinished. Finn swore he heard it once, right before sleep took him. Tobias felt it pass through the porch rail one evening, cold against his knuckles. Even Copper pricked his ears one night, head tilting toward nothing. But it wasn't nothing. It was a promise that no story, once spoken by the wind, is ever truly lost. And so it drifts across time, across silence, across every trail where someone chooses to stop. Listen and remember. Because justice may wear boots and carry a rifle, but mercy rides on the wind, humming the songs of those who dared to matter. And maybe that's what the desert teaches us best. It doesn't erase pain. It holds it, not as a burden, but as a reminder. That silence doesn't always mean weakness. That justice can take time, and that even in a world as rough and dust-bitten as this one, truth can still crawl out of the dirt and find its name carved in stone. Tobias, Finn, and that mule named Copper didn't set out to change anything, but they listened. They stood still when others turned away, and in doing so they rewrote a story meant to stay buried, because the most powerful justice is the kind you don't see coming. If this story left something stirring inside you, something unspoken, drop a comment below. Tell us what it made you feel. Save this video so the wind can bring you back when you need it. And if stories like this speak your language, hit subscribe. You'll find we've got plenty more truth buried out here, just waiting to be unearthed.